All right, should be recording now. And let's see. Now we can jump into the legislative update from Senator Barncourt and Representative Madaro.
Awesome. Tony, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back at the Orion Heights Neighborhood Council. Really happy to see some familiar faces, as well as excited to see some new faces on the Zoom. Really, the more folks involved in meetings like this, the better and stronger we are as a community. I know it's been a long and difficult year with COVID-19 that has required us all to change our normal routines. And so I do want to just thank the council board for adjusting and continuing to provide this forum for neighbors to stay engaged and involved. I know shifting these meetings to accommodate folks joining remotely was not easy. And just on behalf of the community, very grateful for your efforts in making this possible. And despite the pandemic and the shift to remote work, my office has also been staying quite busy connecting folks with critical services in the community, as well as working on the legislative response to COVID. But before I shift into the response to COVID, I do want to share just a few brief updates on some exciting initiatives that have been happening around the community. First of all, there's a relatively new group by the name of Tree Easty that formed, and they had their first event during the pandemic, in which we planted a whole host of trees all along Liberty Plaza and Central Square. And in addition, we passed out dozens of trees to folks across the community from Orion Heights to Jeffries Point and to Eagle Hill. This is a particularly exciting initiative because our community persists in having the lowest tree canopy in the entire city. So anything we could do to get more trees in the neighborhood is really positive. So stay tuned for more events from Tree Easty and other ways to potentially get your own tree. Another initiative I wanted to update you on was Recovery on the Harbor, which is a new recovery center that opened right in Orion Heights next to Little Asia on Bennington Street. It's a program of the North Suffolk Mental Health Association, which is the largest provider of behavioral health services in our community. I was able to go there with the senator and some others at the grand opening just a few weeks ago. It's really a nice facility. There's recovery coaching there, opportunities for job training, as well as just a place for folks to gather and be together. So if you are in recovery, if you know anyone in recovery, Recovery on the Harbor is a great place to go to, and it's right here in our community. I also wanted to share a quick update on the East Boston Senior Center, which is currently being built at the Orion Heights branch, the former Orion Heights branch library. The construction is underway. This is something, a senior center is something I had heard my whole life in this community. Folks have been pushing for that. So the fact that we will hopefully be able to be together in person and cut the ribbon soon is really, really exciting. So stay tuned for that. And the last initiative I wanted to update you on is Pierce Park Phase 3. The planning process is underway. It's being run by the trustees of reservation. Phase 2 and Phase 3 are two pieces of Pierce Park that will effectively double the size of Pierce Park, which I think arguably will give us the best waterfront park in the country. So again, the planning process is currently underway for Phase 3 of Pierce Park. So stay tuned for ways to get involved and definitely give input. Now, next slide, please. Oh, beat me to it, Thorvald. Thank you. So this just gives you a little snapshot on what my office has been dealing with during the pandemic. First of all, we've helped over 350 constituents with their unemployment claims, with more coming in each and every week. So if you or anyone you know needs help with unemployment, please send them our way, and we're happy to help. And I do just want to pause and give a really big shout out to Glorabelle and Stephen from my team, both of whom are on the Zoom tonight. This is always a 24/7 type of job, working in this business. But the way the two of them have stepped up on behalf of this community during the pandemic, just tireless work over the course of months. I'm just so grateful for them. And I really believe that we're fortunate to have them working on our behalf here in East Boston. And really, likewise, I've never been more proud of our community overall, because I saw folks really step up to help our neighbors in need. Folks come together to care for, uplift, and comfort each other during really difficult moments of loss, need, and pain. And I'll be honest, I'm always proud to represent this community in the legislature, but I've never been more proud than to see how our community banded together to help our own during what is arguably the most difficult time in our lives. Now, in terms of the legislative response on COVID, first of all, we passed what was hailed as the country's strongest evictions and foreclosure moratorium, helping renters and mortgage payers, including small landlords across our community impacted by the COVID pandemic. We were also able to expand access to telehealth services, which was really important because, first of all, we didn't want folks going into hospitals infested with COVID, and it was much safer to allow folks to use telehealth services. But beyond that, we ensured that insurance companies would cover both primary care and behavioral health services through telehealth. That's not temporary just for the pandemic. That will be moving forward as well. We were also able to provide critical funding for the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center to continue providing essential services for our community. And I do just want to thank so many folks in our community and beyond who work at the health center. I'm sure many of you know this, but we were the hardest hit neighborhood in the entire city for COVID for much of the pandemic. I wouldn't like to think where we would be at as a community if we didn't have the health center in our backyard, taking care of our community, whether it came to testing, vaccinations now, or anything else. We were also able to pass significant aid for restaurants and small businesses, including alcohol takeout and delivery fees caps. We passed critical unemployment insurance reforms to deal with the large influx of cases from the pandemic. And we recently passed emergency paid sick time, ensuring that residents who miss work due to COVID are actually paid for that time off. We also tackled mail-in voting. So pre-pandemic, I was actually the first legislator in the state to file a mail-in voting bill because I believed that it would break down barriers and increase voter turnout and engagement. We ended up taking that up for COVID due to the pandemic. And in fact, we saw that it was successful. It did increase voter turnout. So that is something we're now working to make a permanent fixture. And I hope that happens sooner rather than later. And in the midst of COVID, we also passed some non-COVID related legislation. I want to just tick through real quick. First of all, a pretty significant police reform bill that created standards and certification to increase public trust. We passed a maternal health bill to protect women of color who are more likely to die in childbirth, as well as a transportation bond bill that provides critical transportation infrastructure with significant money to upgrade the Blue Line, addressing issues of capacity and speed, as well as millions of dollars for intersection and infrastructure improvements to support the transportation recommendations of Plan East Boston, which is actually being quarterbacked by an Orion Heights resident, our dear friend Jason Ruggiero. And that money includes the redesign of the Bennington Street corridor, Day Square, some improvements really all around East Boston, but those are just a couple of them to name. Next slide, please. Oh, can you go back one slide, actually? Yes, thank you. So the next issue I want to touch on is environmental justice. A few weeks ago, Governor Baker signed our climate roadmap bill into law, which is what the slide talks about. But included in this bill was the landmark environmental justice law that I filed and have been working on for some time with some amazing community activists, including some neighbors of ours in East Boston, John Waukee and Marcos Luna, as well as their colleagues at Green Roots, which is a wonderful nonprofit right over the bridge in Chelsea. This bill codifies environmental justice into law for the first time in state history, and it also defines environmental justice populations and strengthens the community process for EJ communities like us here in East Boston. So EJ communities like Eastie have borne a disproportionate amount of environmental burdens for far too long. And this bill will provide stronger protections for communities like ours against pollution and the cumulative impact of these burdens. So the senator and I were recently reelected. In January, kicked off the 2-year cycle that we serve in these capacities. And basically, after getting sworn in, the first order of business is filing our legislative agenda. In this session, we filed some really important bills, and I want to take a few minutes just to highlight some of them this evening. Next slide, please. Thank you. The first bill I'll talk about touches on universal child care. Now, some of you may know that my wife, Arielle, and I are expecting our first child in under a month at this point. And what you might not know is that we actually both studied child development at Tufts University and met in a child development class over a decade ago. And something that we've always been passionate about and even discussed back then in college was the need for universal child care in order to level the playing field for children and families from all walks of life. And of course, while Arielle and I are overjoyed at becoming parents ourselves, the closer we come to that due date, the more the following two important facts are becoming abundantly clear. First of all, childcare is really, really expensive. In fact, Massachusetts has the highest childcare costs in the country. And second of all, it's extremely difficult to balance childcare with jobs as working parents. And I recognize not everyone is so lucky to have someone like my mom living next door to lend a helping hand. And the reality is the lack of affordable and accessible childcare creates a ton of issues. A lot of young people defer having children because of cost. For people who have children, it often inhibits their ability to participate in the workplace or advance their career, a fact that is especially true for women. This, plus the cost of childcare, makes this a big economic issue. So the bill that we filed creates a framework for childcare funding to make sure that quality childcare is available and affordable to every family based on their budget. The next subject I want to touch on, next slide, please. These are a couple of bills I filed in the housing space. So first of all, housing discrimination continues to be a major issue in East Boston and beyond, specifically discrimination by real estate brokers, particularly against people of color and those who have rental vouchers. The bill that I filed increases, I should say, protections against broker discrimination through increased anti-bias training and stronger penalties for violations. And speaking of housing vouchers, another piece of legislation I filed touches on the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, also known as MRVP. Obviously, a huge issue in our community is housing affordability. MRVP is a housing voucher program similar to Section 8 that really is a critical tool to assist people with being able to afford rent. The bill that I filed will improve MRVP by codifying it into state law and making some important changes that will allow more aid to reach more people. We will also continue to be vocal advocates in other important pieces of housing legislation, like the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction, the Homes Act, which seals eviction records, which I know the senator will talk about, that's his bill, as well as the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, giving existing residents the opportunity to purchase the buildings they live in, thus allowing families the chance to remain in their communities, something we desperately need in East Boston to maintain the rich, diverse fabric of our community. Next slide, please. This slide touches on a bill I filed for in-state tuition equity. So right now, undocumented students living in Massachusetts are treated as out-of-state residents when attending Massachusetts state colleges and universities. And I honestly believe that this isn't right because these are our kids. Most of the time they grew up here, and Massachusetts may be the only home that they know. This is especially true in an immigrant gateway community like ours. And this was true for some of my friends that I grew up with in East Boston. Kids I played Little League with and attended Boston Latin School with who didn't find out that they had this challenge until they went to apply for college. So this bill would give undocumented students living in Massachusetts access to the same in-state tuition rates as any other resident. And this really will help many young people across the Commonwealth pursue their educational goals and professional goals affordably. And my office will also continue to prioritize other pro-immigrant pieces of legislation that would offer immense benefits to our neighbors in East Boston and beyond, like driver's licenses for all and the Safe Communities Act. Next slide, please. Couple transportation issues I want to update you on. So first of all, I filed a bill to provide a low-income fare on the T. COVID has shown just how important the T is for our essential workers, especially on the Blue Line, which saw the lowest decline in ridership out of any branch during the pandemic. And as we look towards reopening post-COVID, it is important that we get people back on the T instead of into cars, which would just create increased traffic and pollution. So the bill I filed creates a low-income fare to help more people access important T services. Now, interestingly, this bill was actually passed overwhelmingly by both the House and the Senate last session. Unfortunately, it was vetoed by the governor, and we ran out of time to override his veto. So we're back at it, filing it again, and keeping up the fight. And the other piece of transportation legislation I wanted to touch on is specific to East Boston. So before COVID, Boston had the dubious distinction of being the most congested city in the country. And Eastie was pretty much like the epicenter of that congestion due to traffic from airport passengers and commuters from the North Shore cutting through our community on their way to work into downtown Boston. And while the pandemic has given us temporary relief from that traffic, as things begin to reopen, and we can already see it creeping back now, it's going to get worse. And that's why I refiled this bill requiring a congestion study in East Boston to determine the scope and root causes of these issues. But just as importantly, the bill also calls for a pilot program of congestion pricing to incentivize people who have the flexibility to drive during off-peak hours to do so, thus reducing rush hour congestion for the rest of us. Next slide, please. The next bill that I want to touch on really speaks to a major issue we're seeing in East Boston and any other immigrant community, and that's addressing access to government services for people who speak a language other than English. So the bill I filed, an act relative to language access and inclusion, would do just that. And I think a big example of this came during the COVID pandemic with the unemployment system. The online portal was only in English, so workers who spoke another language faced a huge hurdle in accessing the benefits they had a right to receive. And, if you think of our community in East Boston, that negatively impacted thousands of our neighbors. Glorbell from my team spent countless hours on the phone providing translation services for folks in our community. But folks, this is not how things should work. So the bill I filed would make sure that information, forms, and translation services are readily available across government agencies. Next slide, please. Following the success of our environmental justice bill being signed into law, we've been working on a few other important bills which will strengthen the environmental justice communities like Eastie and build off that important work that we did previously. The first one I want to touch on is the Logan Airport's impact bill, which I co-filed with Senator Boncory. Like the traffic, we've also seen a temporary respite from the worst impacts of Logan Airport during the pandemic, but things are beginning to reopen. We hear the planes again, and we know operations will soon be back to normal. Over the past several months, we've been working with a group of scientists from Olin College, studying pollution from Logan Airport, as well as partnering with local groups like Air Inc. and East Boston Mothers Out Front. And through that work, we've developed a bill that begins to address the problem through 4 pillars. First, we're going to set up a network of over 100 air pollution monitors throughout our community. Right now, Massport does not do regular real-time measuring of air pollution. They only model. These monitors will give us real-time data of when and where we are experiencing the most pollution and what the specific sources are. Secondly, we're going to require that the state monitor ultrafine particulates, also known as UFPs, which are really tiny air particles that our lungs can't even filter, and they're actually really dangerous. Airports are an enormous emitter of UFPs, and we need to make sure that they're being monitored and that we can therefore or thereby mitigate the impacts. Third, the bill would require a revised Logan health study. The last health study in 2010 went over length and under budget, and it did not make any explicit connections between health issues and pollution. The revised health study will fill some of those gaps. And in addition, a health study like this for host communities shouldn't be dependent on negotiated mitigation, as was the case a decade ago, but should occur in regular intervals, which is exactly what this legislation will do. And lastly, to begin mitigating the effects of this air pollution where it's most needed, our bill requires Massport to install air purifiers, also known as HEPA filters, in all schools within 2 miles of the airport. By providing air filtration at schools, we can begin to mitigate some of the worst pollution effects on our kids and their development. Now, folks, this bill is merely a first step. The ultimate goal is an airproofing program for residential homes, similar to the soundproofing program that currently exists for East Boston residents. The next piece of legislation I want to touch on reforms the Energy Facility Siting Board. And this is another issue that I partnered with Senator Boncory on. The East Boston community got a firsthand view of the problems with the Energy Facility Siting Board, also known as the EFSB, through the East Boston substation process. Now, despite near universal and well-organized opposition from countless East Boston residents, advocates, and elected officials, the EFSB recently unanimously voted in favor of allowing the substation to proceed. This bill will reform the EFSB process, requiring them to take environmental justice and climate resiliency into account. It adds a new community seat to the board, thereby giving us an actual voice in the decision-making process, and it improves community outreach and language access. Now, this bill won't necessarily reverse the East Boston substation decision, which is currently being appealed, but it will take those lessons into account to be learned from moving forward. Next slide, please. The last couple of bills I want to update you on. First, an act relative to access to justice. This legislation protects against government programs that are supposed to be neutral, but end up having a discriminatory or disproportionately harmful impact on people of certain protected classes by allowing these programs to be challenged in state court. Essentially, what this bill does is it protects environmental justice communities like ours by giving us the opportunity to sue in state court, something we do not currently have. And the last piece of legislation I want to update you on is a bill we call Food Justice with Jobs, another issue I partnered with Senator Boncory on. The pandemic made it abundantly clear that an ad hoc piecemeal approach to addressing food insecurity is simply unsustainable. Everyone should have access to fresh and healthy food. So we introduced a bill to assist communities in establishing gardens owned and operated by the community to grow locally produced healthy food and create job opportunities for our residents in this space at the same time. Eastie Farm is the successful model we're basing this off of, and we want to see more Eastie Farms in our neighborhood. The bill also creates a program to assist people in creating their own gardens at home so people can grow healthy produce for themselves and their families. Next slide, and I believe this is the last slide. So just a couple of exciting things I wanted to update you on. I wanted to share the exciting news that I was recently appointed as chair of the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Use, and Recovery. This committee focuses on mental health, behavioral health, substance use, addiction, treatment, and recovery. And this is such an important issue for Eastie and the whole state. I don't know any family, my own included, or any corner of the Commonwealth that hasn't been affected by these issues. And these issues, of course, have always been important, but coming out of the pandemic, with all the isolation, the lack of socialization, job loss, food and housing insecurity, health challenges, and grieving the loss of loved ones, these issues are definitely more pronounced than ever before. In fact, I recently read an alarming statistic. We've had more opioid-related deaths over the course of the pandemic than we have in the past few years, which just highlights the fact that the opioid epidemic continues to rage within the broader COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, we're seeing higher rates of children's and adult mental health issues than ever before. So I'm really excited and grateful to get the chance to work on these issues that are so tangible in our communities. And I look forward to making a positive impact on these subjects over the course of the session. So in closing, I just want to let you know that we love hearing from East Boston residents. I know we'll do some Q&A after the senator speaks. But I want to be clear, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. Our contact info is on the screen. Stephen or Glorbell from my team will also be sending around the link to our newsletter, which we try to get out every so often. It's just another good way to stay up to date on what we're doing at the State House and in the community. But without further ado, I want to introduce our state senator, my dear friend. As you can tell, we work really well together. We partner on a lot of things, and we're real fortunate to have him representing us in the state Senate. Joe Boncore.
Thank you, Representative. It's great to be here with everyone at Orion Heights Neighborhood Association. I want to thank Tony, Tara, and Noah for the invitation to sort of share, what's gone on in the last session and what work my office is looking forward to doing in this session. I have to say it's really a joy to work with Representative Modero and representing in East Boston. We both were just reelected and have a 2-year term. And I'm just so happy, really, that the House and Speaker Mariano have recognized what we've known in East Boston for so long in Representative Modero's leadership abilities. Taking over as the new chair of the Mental Health and Substance Use Disorder Committee is so crucially important. It's an issue, as the representative said, that touches every corner of this Commonwealth and every family within it. So I'm so looking forward to working with him now as a member of the leadership team in the House. This session, I was reappointed as chair of the Senate's Transportation Committee. I've also been asked to join Senator President Spilka's leadership team as the chair of the Personnel and Administration Committee, as well as staying on as vice chair of the Rules Committee. As a reminder, as always, my office is available to provide assistance. And whether it's finding a COVID-19 vaccination information or help with unemployment, which is certainly the #1 call that we've gotten in this past year, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I want to introduce the newest member of my staff, Paula Villatoro, who is an Orion Heights resident and who you'll be seeing at meetings into the future. So I really just want to share a few of the bills. I filed over 66 bills this legislative session, and I'm not going to go over all of them, and I'm trying not to be repetitive of what the representative has covered. I know the representative touched on a few of the bills we passed in the last session as it relates to unemployment assistance, voting rights, and healthcare. But I do want to speak about one bill that I played a rather large role in as Senate chair of the Transportation Committee, and that's the Transportation Bond Bill. The Transportation Bond Bill represents a $16 billion investment to accelerate transportation projects statewide. The provisions, including in this Transportation Bond Bill, will invest, modernize, and really reform the Commonwealth's transportation system. Like I said, as chair of the Transportation Committee, I had a lot to say in what happened in this bill. And I worked to ensure that this bill really represents not only the long-term transportation infrastructure goals of the Commonwealth, but also taking care of some of the short-term projects that we will need to build our way out of COVID. And these include a more than $4 billion investment in the MBTA system, creating a new commuter rail stop at Wonderland Station. So those who are coming from the North Shore can get out of their cars and have an opportunity to meet the T in Revere, as well as improving the Blue Line to increase its capacity and serve more riders between Bowdoin and Wonderland stations by upping the electrification and signalization standards on the Blue Line. We've also invested $695 million in the Green Line to see that project through. Through the amendment process and working in constant communication with the representative, we were able to really, take care of some projects in East Boston. So out of the $7.5 million that I brought to my district, $4.2 million went directly to projects in East Boston, including a $2.5 million redesign of the Bennington Street corridor to make it more accessible for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as slowing people down generally on Bennington Street. Another $1 million was set aside to create a public plaza in Day Square to support local businesses and restaurants. We are also able to secure another $700,000 in traffic safety improvements in the neighborhood of Jeffries Point. We also addressed a number of policy areas around transportation, most of which were vetoed by the governor, like Representative Mataro's low-income fare program. But we're able to decriminalize fare evasion. That was not vetoed by the governor, and really no one who can't afford the fare should really have the disastrous effects that come with the criminal record and the collateral consequences. So decriminalizing fare evasion, I think, will go a long way in making our system a more equitable one. Turning to the 66 bills I filed this year, as transportation chair, the most important bill I filed this year is the Transportation New Deal. I've worked to ensure in my time on this committee that transportation is looked at as a public good. A reliable and efficient public transportation system is really central to the Commonwealth's health and economic recovery as we build again out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, building a more equitable, accessible, and resilient transportation is something that we can start dedicating efforts and resources to really right now. So the Transportation New Deal is really just a starting point. It touches on and recognizes the initial set of policies that we must undertake to move Massachusetts forward and modernizing our transportation system and ensuring regional equity as well as socioeconomic equity throughout the system. I focused on key measures to make public transit more equitable. The first is a fare-free MBTA bus and system, as well as RTAs. Those are regional transit authorities for those living outside Greater Boston who don't have access to the MBTA, as well as the low-income fare program that Representative Mataro hit on. We also initiate a policy to freeze fares on the MBTA. We want to get people out of their cars and onto the MBTA system. However, the current MBTA makeup and fiscal control board has failed to recognize that. And while over the past 10 years, fares have risen more than 300%, the gas tax has remained flat. So this bill will recognize that and freeze fares for 5 years. We also undertake some other policies as piloting a reduced commuter rail fare during off-peak hours, making that commuter rail really more of a regional rail system to serve the Commonwealth all day with a more frequent, reliable service. We also take steps to pilot a late night service on the MBTA for those returning from the third shift, as well as expanding parking at commuter rail stations. So people have more opportunity to leave their car at a commuter rail station, get on the commuter rail, what we're hoping will be a regional rail. And so many people won't be driving into the city. In the transportation sector, I've also filed legislation with Mass Vote called the FARE Act that would make public transit free on the bus and subway system on election days. While other states are rolling back, access to the ballot box, I think this will really improve and expand the number of people that will be voting. In housing justice, as we know, access to affordable housing and safe housing continues to be a very important issue in this Commonwealth. And in order to meet our housing goals of affordability, we need to ensure that housing demand is really being met across the Commonwealth. And that happens not only by just building housing, but also including the voices of all stakeholders. So last session, we did pass critically important legislation during the Economic Development Bill to require transit-oriented development and to ensure tenant representation on local housing authority boards while supporting smart growth zone districts. This session, I filed a bill to authorize a commission to research and establish regional housing production goals. So much housing is happening and taking place in our city of Boston. However, so many of the cities and towns around the city of Boston, while Boston is expanding and growing at such a clip, are really, not helping in those efforts. And when they have an opportunity, they're down zoning their zoning requirements across the board. So we're asking for really a regional approach, not a Boston only approach, but a regional approach to housing production. Additionally, this session, I filed the Homes Act along with the help of Councilor Lydia Edwards, and this bill would create a process to sale eviction records and then prevent those sealed records from being reported to housing and credit agencies across the Commonwealth. The Homes Act protects minors from being named in eviction cases and would go further in expunging their names from ever appearing on an eviction record. We know that housing is a human right in this Commonwealth, and we need to protect our most vulnerable populations from being denied housing. In the area of climate justice, kind of on the heels of the legislation that we did last session to prevent our environmental justice communities and continue to make Massachusetts a leader. I filed legislation to call for all vehicles owned or leased by the Commonwealth to be zero emission vehicles by 2035. That goes from our DPW vehicles to our fire trucks, to our buses and trains that we rely on for public transportation. I've also filed another bill to move Massachusetts to 100% clean energy by 2045. And I've also joined the Mass Renews Alliance, as Representative Madero talked about, to really bolster urban farms. And he went into detail on that, so I won't. Broadband access is something that we've found to be essential during this pandemic in ensuring that our communities have equitable access to their jobs, but it also so children and students have access to education. Companies like Comcast have no right putting residents in a difficult financial situation during in the middle of a public health crisis. So the legislation I filed would require broadband internet companies to be treated like any other utility service. And as a utility service, it would be prohibited from shutting broadband, companies would be prohibited from shutting broadband access off due to an unpaid bill during the school year. As most of you know, prior to joining the Senate, I was a public defender in East Boston, the East Boston division of the Boston Municipal Court, I should say. So criminal justice reform has been at the forefront of my legislative agenda since joining the Senate 5 years ago. So last year I filed and supported provisions in the Reform, Shift and Build Act. This year I filed the Raise the Age legislation to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction to include transition-aged youth, including 18, 19, and 20 years old. And that standard really reflects what we know about cognitive development. It would go further to reducing recidivism and ensuring better incomes for the youth in our communities. So I know what we want to get to questions. I find in these community meetings, that's the most helpful process to us for representatives, really to understand what the community is looking for. So I'll end there. I just want to say that throughout the course of this session, I look forward to hearing from you. Although this is the first conversation of the session, I'm hoping it will not be the last. So Paolo will be putting up our contact information in the chat with our email and phone number. I'd also ask you to sign up to my monthly newsletter so we can keep you apprised of legislative actions that we're taking throughout this session. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you to both Representative Madaro and Senator Boncory. We did have one question earlier that Stephen had answered in the chat. But just so folks maybe who didn't catch it in the chat, they're curious. Patricia Powers asked, where or who do I call to get info on the new senior center? And you can reach out to Representative Madaro's office, message Stephen sorry if I'm gonna butcher your last name again, Gingras, in the chat here, or call 857-293-1465.
Tony, I am happy to just quickly address Patricia's question. So the senior center is supposed to open fall of this year. So it's coming up, and that's really exciting. There's going to be robust programming, but that conversation still needs to happen. And I think she asked about handicap parking as well. We've heard that from a number of residents. I don't think plans are finalized on that yet, but we're working with the city. Ricardo is here representing Councilor Edwards. They're well aware of this too. And we're all trying to make sure that this can be as accessible and as engaging as possible for all our seniors in the community.
Thank you. We have a thank you from Jane Manning. She says, thank you to Rep. Madaro and Senator Boncory for your presentations to the OHNC.
Thank you, Jane. Good to see you.
Happy to be here.
I don't see any more questions coming in.
Well, if anyone has questions, if they feel like asking later or another time, you have the contact info for both my office and the senator's office. So please never hesitate to reach out. And Tony, to you and the board, thank you so much for giving us space on the agenda tonight and allowing us to provide this update. It was great to see you all.
Yes, thank you for speaking. And we'll pass along all the information that you provided in the chat with our meeting minutes tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. Great to see everyone.
Right, so next up on our agenda, I believe we have just a quick thing that I noticed because I had scheduled today's meeting. Obviously today is Patriots Day, which is a state holiday. When I was making all of the Zoom meetings, I looked at federal holidays, unfortunately did not look at the state holidays. So then I took a look at the bylaws to see if there were specifics around what qualifies as a holiday. And I noticed that it said including holidays instead of excluding. And I thought originally that this was perhaps the bylaws were not updated with the amendments that were approved in November 2019. But upon further investigation, I looked at the written out substantive and typographical edits that were approved. And it said including there too. And there was also mention of the treasurer role that was removed elsewhere within the bylaws. That was still in there. I thought that anonymous voting was not mentioned, but it was. So that was just me missing something while reviewing it. So as long as there are no objections, I will just review the edits and then, if necessary, apply them to the bylaws as they were approved. I know that it said including, but I'm pretty sure that that meant to say excluding holidays. So if there is no objection, I will just change that to say excluding. And then going forward, perhaps we could have like a discussion around what holidays, because I know there are some religious holidays as well that we want to observe and have the meeting on the following Tuesday. So I just wanted to note that. That I'll just fix what is lingering in the bylaws from that update in 2019. Another thing that we have on the agenda to mention is the boundaries of Orient Heights. I actually received a little slip to join the Harborview Neighborhood Association in my mailbox, I think last week, the week before. And I know that there was a discussion that happened previously around it might have been between the two neighborhood associations, and the agreement, I believe, was Bennington from Trident to Neptune was considered Harborview, but I'm not positive on that because I know the end of my street, Wordsworth Street, up near like the single digit houses, I know that's considered Harborview. And in my investigations, I couldn't find anything official from the city that mentioned like zoning boundary area wise. Harborview, I found a Lower Orient Heights reference, which is kind of the same line of Trident to Neptune, but it's not just from Bennington. So that being said, I don't have an official answer. We would have to update the bylaws if that's the case, because at the beginning of the bylaws, we do mention that Orient Heights is from Wordsworth to the Revere and Winthrop borders. So this might be something that we would have to, I suppose, discuss with Harborview again. I couldn't find any record of when that was discussed previously. So I'm not sure like officially where that was left off. But it is something that we would have to vote on as far as updating the bylaws, because we do specifically mention that in there. Not sure if anyone has any questions on that, but that's just the update that I have. And if there are no questions on either that topic or the other bylaws, we can move into our development presentation tonight, which is 970 Saratoga Street. And I believe Rich is on the call.
Tony, I'm trying to do this through my phone. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Excellent. So I'll go ahead and try to share my screen. I'm away on vacation. It's a little tough to maneuver the logistics here, but let me make sure I can share the screen. So bear with me 1 second.
Of course.
Are you able to see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. Looks like it's working well. All right, perfect. Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Linz. I represent MG2, the project proponent for the project 970 Saratoga Street. On the call with me is Sandra Benito. She is the development director for MG2. We also have Eric Zackerson, who's the project architect. So I know we've presented this to the community previously. There are some updates we want to review, but this project has been, we've had some feedback from the neighborhood and have certainly listened to some of the comments that we've heard and made some changes based upon what those comments were. So I'm going to run through the presentation and then happy to answer any questions at the end. But before I do that, let me introduce Sandra Benito, who is the MG2 development director. If she wants to say a couple of things about MG2. So Sandra, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Hear you.
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, well, we get really excited when we have the opportunity to develop sites that are near public transportation, and especially one that is an intersection, a runabout like this one, because runabouts are meant to decelerate traffic and create great opportunities for foot traffic to happen at disjunctures. So in general, we have a form, and this is a newly formed group inside MG2, and we work very closely with our architects to revise and fully develop all of the projects that we are in charge of, with the responsibility to the community and to the newest trends in urban revitalization, with the ultimate goal to create thoughtful architecture and therefore secure value. And that's it for us. Without further ado, I'll leave you with Rich.
Thank you, Sam. So I think everybody's relatively familiar with the area, but just give people an overview of the specific site that we're talking about. Currently, this is used for surface parking, located directly in the center there of the square. And it's been vacant for quite some time. So I think most people who are familiar with the area don't really have any recollection of any structures that were being on it. So our proposal would involve a complete redevelopment of the existing site, which is, I know subject to some concern and issues that have been raised at the previous community meeting, but I think that based upon what we feel is an appropriate use for this site, this project makes a lot of sense for the area. It's pretty consistent with city and planning guidelines for squares, and this is something that we feel is a good first step to trying to redevelop what is an underutilized site for the area. So what I'm showing on the screen is the Boston Planning and Development Agency abstract. The red shaded area is the, and the site itself is actually located in 2 zoning subdistricts. One of the zoning subdistricts is the 3F 2000 residential district, and that's about maybe 1/4 of the site. And the remaining site, the majority of it, 3/4 of it, is probably located in the neighborhood shopping district. The Boston zoning code says that when a site like this it spans 2 zoning districts, the district that is the predominant district, which in this case would be the neighborhood shopping district, is the applicable regulation. So we will apply the neighborhood shopping district regulations to this site, and I'll walk through that when I get to the zoning summary. So real quick overview, we would remove the existing surface parking. The lot is about 6,031 square feet. The proposal would create a new transit-oriented development, which is within walking distance of MBTA rail and bus services. You know, and the fact that this is located relatively close to the Orient Heights station gives it a perfect opportunity for this type of development for higher density, lower parking ratios, and access to public transportation. The building itself would be a 4-story multifamily structure. We are proposing ground level commercial space, which is consistent with the planning objectives for the neighborhood shopping district. At this time, we are proposing 11 parking spaces, and there will be 14 residential units. Our units would be a mixture of studio 1-bed, 2-bed, 1-bath, and 2-bed, 2-bath units, and their sizes would range as small as 465 for the studio, up to 1,360 square feet, which is a generously sized 3-bedroom unit, and that is consistent with planning guidelines for larger family-sized units. As part of this, because we are requesting zoning relief, anytime you propose a project that is in excess of 10 units, we are required to provide affordable units or income-restricted units, and therefore, based upon the city's percentages, 13% of these units would have to be income restricted. That means 2 units out of the 14 would have deed restrictions that would require us, whether this is a rental or a condo project, would require us to ensure that we're meeting the guidelines for what we call inclusionary development. So 2 of the 14 units would actually go towards assisting the city with its affordable housing goal. We feel that this proposal will enhance the streetscape, and certainly the layout of the square, and we are intending to rent these units upon completion. That doesn't necessarily mean it will always remain rental. We could decide during construction to convert this to a condo project, but right now the proposal is to do this as a rental. I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides. We can always come back and talk about them afterwards. But right now, this is a figure ground plan that shows in 3 dimension the existing conditions and the proposed conditions of the square. You can see off on the existing condition side the vacant portion of the site, the vacant portion on the left-hand side of the screen, and then the proposed development and the scale and the massing for the building that we're proposing in relationship to the surrounding buildings in the square. This is our site plan. We can come back to this for reference, but this is the engineer's plan showing the boundaries of our property. I know a lot of people feel that this area that's to the left of our site, if looking at it from Saratoga, is part of our site, but it's actually an egress portion for egress for the existing restaurant that's located to the left of our site. At this time, I'd like to have Eric Zackerson walk through the program for the building itself, and then he can talk a little bit about the design elements that have gone into this. So Eric, if you could walk through, and I'll work to advance the slides as you present.
Sure, thank you, Rich. And apologies, this is a little bit confusing because it's oriented differently from everything we've seen before. In the plan, sorry, in the plan.
Eric, we're having a little hard time hearing you, Eric. If you could, I don't know if you could adjust your volume.
Yeah. Is that better? I can sit closer.
A little bit.
Okay. I'll just speak up and see if that covers it. On the
Better.
left, this drawing is oriented a little differently than everything we've seen before. The left side of the screen would be Saratoga Street and the retail entrance directly off of Saratoga. And then across the bottom of the page would be Boardman Street. And so you'd see along Boardman, you would see a residential lobby and the residential parking entrance. But the important thing here is that on the square, we wanted to make sure that there was a large retail space, a presence to help enhance the streetscape and help enhance the vibrancy of the square. And so there's 2,500 square feet of retail there. And then as you would progress along Boardman Street, you would come to the residential lobby, and then you would come to the 11 residential parking spaces that Rich had mentioned. The plan of this is fairly bare bones because there's kind of, we're making as much use of the residential parking as we can, and we want to really give the bulk of what's left to the retail. So the lobby is kind of narrow and therefore unassuming, but it's only a 14-unit building, and so we wanted to make sure we treated that appropriately. Can we flip to the next slide? So here we see the second story, which consists of these 7 units. A few of them are larger 2-bedrooms right along the front of the building, but the majority of these are 1-bedroom and studio units, the smaller units for the building. But along our neighbor's site, the easement that Rich had talked about would be the circulation spine, an elevator with 2 stairs, and then in front of that is a corridor, and all of the units would face out towards either Boardman or Saratoga Street. Each of these units is, we've tried very hard to make sure that almost all the units have a little bit of outdoor space. That seems to be very important to the various residents, and you know, all of us are feeling that pinch right now. Next slide, please. These units are a little bit more interesting on the 3rd floor because each of these is the lower level of a duplex unit. Most of them are oriented so that the bedrooms are on the 3rd floor and the living space and a little bit of the outdoor space are on the 4th floor. A few of them are oriented in such a way that the living and kitchen, but particularly those 2 on that you see on the left, which would be facing Saratoga Street, would have the living and kitchen on the 3rd floor, and then bedrooms up above. But all of those, the other 5 that you see lined up along Boardman Street, would be bedrooms on this floor with a living kitchen space you'll see on the next slide. And this is the upper level of those 7 units. Each of them comes up a staircase to have a living kitchen with the deck space being on the Boardman side or on the Saratoga side. Some of them have a deck space also facing back towards the easement, so they would actually be flow through with a deck on the front and a deck on the back, and thereby have some kind of real outdoor space that they could enjoy, as well as be present on the street and being able to activate the street life. Next slide, please. The key part of the key of that top floor is that we are able to kind of set it back. So we kind of wrap the entire facade with some deck area, so that when you're on the street, it feels a lot like the 3-story buildings that you see in many of the parts of the square, but also has a 4th-story element that reflects the busier nature of the square and some of the existing buildings that we sit kind of kitty corner from it, and that you saw in the massing study that Rich showed earlier. Along the facades, we'd really emphasize kind of a glass storefront where it's appropriate, but then switch over to more conventional materials of some brick, some fiberboard siding that would be representative of a lot of the buildings you see just off of the square, or the more residential buildings that you see that do occupy parts of the square. So we wanted to kind of really emphasize that. But you see the kind of top part of this is that the 4th story is set back, and it becomes more dramatic when you see it in the 3-dimensional renderings, which we'll show in a minute. Next slide, please. And these are the 2 sides that not a lot of people are going to see. The one on the lower side, lower half here, faces towards the restaurant and that easement area or egress area. And then the one at the top of the screen is kind of the face opposite Saratoga Street. And so clearly we haven't shown a lot of windows or a lot of opening. We wanted to focus our energy and budget on the faces that face Saratoga and Boardman Street. Next slide. And so here you see it kind of looking across the street, looking across the roundabout, and you see the lower level is here showing a vibrant retail environment with some pedestrian activity. And then up above, you have the residents, and you have some inset areas for the balconies on the second floor, as well as the third floor balcony being pushed back, or fourth floor decks being pushed back even further. And in this rendering, we were kind of exploring brick at the corner and at the top level, while trying to keep a lot of the sides more reminiscent of the horizontal siding and clapboard that you'd see just down on the left side of the street here, but you see quite a bit as you go down Saratoga Street. So yeah, that's the kind of exploration we're studying right now. So on the left, I'm glad we got this slide in here. This shows what we were showing at the last presentation. People felt like the building was quite massive, and so we really took a knife to the top floor and pared it back so that it would feel less omnipresent or less kind of overpowering, and really emphasize that third floor line, that 3-story line, while preserving the upper level of the duplexes and being able to create some kind of show how that open space doesn't have to feel so in your face or overshadowing. And hopefully this would help appease some of that, but it would definitely eliminate some of the shadows that might be otherwise thrown down onto Boardman as you know, in the winter sun. Next slide. This is looking back up Boardman Street, and you see kind of looking at the roundabout, you see how the building has a kind of a brick facade on the lower level and has upper level that is still very in human scale kind of materials, in particular on the bays, which would be the most prominent component of the facade, the most outward facing elements. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Eric. So real quickly, let me run the requirements under the Boston zoning code. As I said previously, this is predominantly in the neighborhood shopping district. Neighborhood shopping district is defined in Article 53 as one of the more flexible zoning districts in East Boston. Even though we are going through a planning study for the rezoning for the entire neighborhood, neighborhood shopping is intended to preserve a lot of these squares. They're not likely to become residential districts or, you know, strictly just commercial. It's an opportunity for a transition from commercial to residential, and that's why a mixed-use building like what we're proposing here isn't actually allowed use in the neighborhood shopping district. So, you know, ground level retail with upper level residential is precisely the type of use that is encouraged in a neighborhood shopping district, and that's why we are proposing this building to be that type of use. We do have just over 6,000 square feet of land area. There is no minimum lot size, unlike what you see in many of the other residential districts. There is no minimum lot size in the neighborhood shopping district, so therefore we comply with the minimum lot size requirement. The same applies for minimum lot width and side yard. There is no dimensional control in place under Article 53 that says that you have to have so much lot width. Again, just by comparison, you know, for example, the 3F2000, you have to have at least 20 feet of width. Even if that were a requirement, we held well over 100 feet of lot width if you're measuring it along the Boardman Street side. Therefore, we'd be in compliance regardless. Side yard, we don't even have to have a side yard, but despite that, we are proposing a setback of about 3 feet. And the reason for that is so that we can ensure that we can add windows where appropriate, and that allows for light and air to enter into the building. And a lot of people say, well, 3 feet, that's not a lot, you know, especially in a neighborhood like this. But the truth of the matter is, in an urban environment, 3 feet is what the norm typically would be for these types of neighborhoods. So we are proposing to go with what the norm would be to allow for light and air and openings in the side of the building. Our front yard proposed setback is what we call a modal setback. And that is essentially the average setback of the buildings along each of those street fronts. So the building that was recently built at 19 Boardman, sits on the sidewalk. The buildings that are along Saratoga, don't have really a lot of front yard setback as well. So we will elect to go with the modal setback as well, despite the fact that there may be no setback requirement. Our rear yard is an interesting one. We are likely to take advantage of an exception under the zoning code because this is a corner lot and there really is no defined rear yard. When you look at a corner lot, essentially you have two side yards. And remember, the requirements under the zoning code say you don't have to have a side yard at all. So if you're looking at the building from Boardman Street, we do have a side yard on the right. And if you look at it from Saratoga, we have a side yard on the left. So we are proposing a 2-foot setback for what we're defining as the rear yard, even though 10 foot is the requirement. The zoning board looks at corner lots a little differently. So we will ask for what's called interpretation and to have the zoning board assign an appropriate setback, or at least from a design review standpoint, an appropriate setback for the building. The floor area ratio that we're proposing, and that is the relationship of the amount of gross square floor area to how much land we have, is a 3.25. 1.1 is the maximum, and therefore we require a variance for that. I would point out that 3.25 in relationship to a lot of the buildings that are already in the square is relatively consistent with the density that we see in this neighborhood, especially for the commercial and mixed-use buildings that currently occupy the sites. If you just look around, most of the buildings occupy almost the entire lot area. If you look diagonally across the street, there's a 4-story building that really has no setback from its lot lines and therefore is probably quite consistent with the density that we're proposing here. Our height, even though 35 feet is the maximum height limit, 48 feet is what we're proposing, and it is consistent with the building located directly across the street. I would point out that this site is located in the flood hazard district. That creates a special hardship when you're talking about the type of development you will do on a site. We are limited as to what we can propose at the ground level based upon the base flood elevation. So we are going to propose to make this building a bit taller because of the fact that we are limited in what we can do under the base flood elevation that currently exists for the site. So therefore, a variance for height would be necessary. Our open space, we are still determining what that will look like. We are required to have 50 square feet per unit. We think we're going to get there based upon the amount of deck space that we can provide for these units, but we're going to at least be pretty close to the 50 square feet that's required. We're not proposing a roof deck on the upper level of this building. I know a lot of projects that we do present, even the ones that are 4 stories, do propose a roof deck. We are not proposing that with respect to this. So the height of our building will be pretty limited to the upper parapet of that 4th level that is set back somewhat. Last but not least is parking. We originally showed this project at about 6 parking spaces. We've increased that to about 11. I know there's a combination of surface parking as well as stackers that we're looking to do in this building. The zoning code does say that you're supposed to have 27 spaces, but anybody who has had any conversations with the BPDA and the Boston Transportation Department will understand that there's actually a maximum number of parking spaces for projects like this within close proximity to public transportation nodes. Because this is within walking distance of the MBTA's Blue Line Orient Heights station, 75% of the parking requirement is really all that is recommended from Boston Transportation Department. So, we understand that there may be some concerns about actual parking for this project. However, we're trying to be a little bit more consistent with the city planning objectives for parking in this particular project. So we are proposing 11 spaces for the 14 units in the ground level retail. All of that would have to be approved by the Zoning Board of Appeal. This project, unlike some other projects that are larger in the area, does not require Article 80 Boston Planning and Development Agency review. The reason being is we are proposing less than 15 residential units, and we're proposing less than 20,000 square feet of gross floor area. So the only approval that is necessary is from the Zoning Board of Appeal for the items that we're requesting a relief from. That is the overview of the zoning. We are anticipating the remainder of the process to go as follows. We will ultimately request a vote before the Orient Heights Neighborhood Council. And then after that occurs, we will have a hearing before the zoning board for our variances. We anticipate that'll happen sometime this spring, maybe early summer. Assuming we get our approvals, and there's no guarantee that we do, we will go before the Boston Planning Development Agency for design review. That's to ensure that our project meets all the city standards for architecture and design and materials. That will occur, again, assuming we get our zoning approvals. Very, very optimistically, assuming that all happens, fall of 2021 is likely the permit issuance at the earliest. And then this will take about 12 to 16 months to complete. And that is the overview that we have, and I'm happy to answer any questions, Tony.
Thank you. We did get a question early on from Maria Mazzarella asking, where is MG2 based?
MG2 is based, so their corporate offices are in Boston, downtown Boston. They actually have a presence here in East Boston as well. Their property management division, as well as their construction management division, is located on Border Street here in East Boston.
Okay, we have another question from Donna Marie Kurz. It was mentioned that they are excited to be around the circle due to possible foot traffic. Is this project going to work with the community and city to help mitigate the people that ignore stop and yield signs on a circle that is seemingly getting worse, along with congestion, by the day to protect these pedestrians?
That's actually a great question. As part of the BPD design review, typically issues such as traffic management, traffic calming, as well as any additional signage or other measures that may require mitigation can be asked through the BPD design review process. And that's something that becomes the responsibility of the developer and not necessarily the responsibility of the city. So yes, that is something that I would anticipate through BPD design review and their transportation planners, we would hear some input on.
We have another question from Tara Monito saying, do all the units on the second floor have outside space, including the studios? And I know that San Benito is in the chat answering some of these and did say the studio has a deck.
It does. There actually are the two units that you see closest to Saratoga Street actually don't have outdoor space, but the rest do. So there's a large 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom, unit 301 and 302. No, 201 and 202 on the slide before this are the two that don't have outdoor space. It just
this one here?
Yeah, it just wasn't feasible for us to put any real outdoor space. So we created a kind of Juliet balcony off the master bedroom for 201, and 202 just does not have outdoor space, but it's a spacious 2-bedroom, 900 square feet. The rest of them do, including the studio.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. We have a question from Lorraine Burry saying, where is the parking located?
So the access for parking will be on Boardman Street. There's a garage, you can see in this elevation here, there's a garage entranceway that will be located towards I guess for lack of a better term, if you're facing from Saratoga Street, Lorraine, it would be to the rear of the building, but access from Boardman Street, not from Saratoga Street. So probably where the driveway currently exists for access to the site will be about the location of where the garage entrance would be. So not really much of a change for access to the site with parking.
John and Ginny Bertulli asked, what are the boundaries of this shopping district?
I can jump back to that. Bear with me one moment. So the boundary actually runs across the street. It runs through the back quarter portion of this site, and then it extends as you come across where the restaurant is located, then the social, or I call it the social club, the Montessori school. I don't know if that's the use currently. And then to the back portion of the property where a number of those residential properties go. And then it continues down to where Noyes Park entranceway is off of Saratoga Street across from the restaurant. So the new building that is being constructed where the old auto repair shop was is also part of the neighborhood shopping district. And it extends all the way up to and around the remainder of Orion Heights Square. So actually across Bennington Street, all of the businesses on the Bennington Street side, down past Dunkin' Donuts, et cetera, all part of the neighborhood shopping district.
Okay, we have a question from Patricia Powers asking, why must you keep building to the sidewalk? And Stan did mention the building massing is broken down into highly recessed and at many areas, especially the curved corner.
So the question was, why do we build to the sidewalk? It's an interesting situation that we come across a lot. There aren't a lot of, especially in neighborhood shopping districts, there aren't a lot of setback requirements already. The zoning code actually encourages, so you don't have I guess an inconsistent rhythm is the description I would give it, of buildings. They want buildings to be consistent in their alignment. And that's why we have what's called a modal setback versus an actual setback. So even where the zoning code says perhaps that it's a 10-foot setback requirement, if the predominant setback along that block is 0, meaning at the sidewalk, that's how the city wants the block planned. And that's so you don't get this, inconsistent setback of buildings along a streetscape. That's something that's very common in urban planning. I'm sure if you walk around the built environment, you'll see that is, a pretty consistent precedent that you'll find in and around that neighborhood. I think most of the buildings in and around the square sit at the sidewalk, so it really wouldn't make a lot of sense to set this building back.
Robert DeMeo said, this is a Saratoga Street address. Where are the dwelling entries egress?
So the Saratoga Street address, which I want to point out to people is not necessarily a significant issue. That really comes down to what the city of Boston identifies the parcel as, for lack of a better description. And in this case, they've identified it as Saratoga. The entrance will be on Boardman Street, but that doesn't really have any relevance to zoning or planning.
Okay, we have a comment from 964 Saratoga Street saying there is an existing egress from the rear of the restaurant at 964 Saratoga. By 968 Saratoga proposal making a 2 feet setback that effectively blocks the egress from the back. That is causing a hazardous condition for the restaurant at 964 Saratoga.
We are not blocking any rights in the 964 Saratoga property are not going to be impacted by this proposed development. Any egress rights, or that's what I talked about previously, you can actually see it on this map. There is a setback between the existing building, although it's hard to tell on the ground because it looks like, I suspect that vehicles park right up to the building now. But that, when this building is built, there would actually be a setback between the building, the restaurant building, and our proposed building. It's actually pretty significant. It's more than 2 feet. Our setback on our property is 2 feet, but there's even more of a setback from their building. So the separation would actually be larger. And then based upon, essentially what's in their title, they have defined rights in access. We're not going to impact or impair any of those rights at all with respect to this proposal.
Okay, Patricia Powers said, we need more landscaping around the building and more parking for that many units. Maria Zola said another massive box-like structure to be built with a potential 30 more units at the new tread site. Lorraine Burry had said a massive building for this corner. See, Joe Ruggiero said we should allow them to build bigger on new tread lots and leave this lot alone. Gail had mentioned this project being reviewed by our newly created design review committee, which last meeting we put that off so that we could get the boundaries set before moving projects over there. So that's why it's being presented at the meeting tonight. Let's see. Tom Bruno said massive structure without enough parking. We are losing off-street parking for the surrounding businesses. Gail Miller said, if you are allowing a build up higher at New Tread, you are butting up to neighbors behind the project. Certainly consideration needs to be taken into account. The lot across the street does not have many neighbors behind their lot. Let's see. Gail Miller also echoed the parking sentiment, saying parking is key. There is not enough parking now for all the current businesses.
I just want to point out to Gail's comment, there's not enough parking for current businesses.
Mhm.
This lot is not required parking for current businesses. So, the concept that, somehow there's not enough parking for current businesses, I'm not passing the buck here, Gail, but that's not necessarily the fault of this property owner. The businesses that exist in the square are the businesses, and the planning for the square has preceded any development proposal for this site. We are providing parking on this site. We're doing it at a reduced rate that's consistent with Boston Transportation Department and the Environment Department's regulations. So this is something that fits probably better for a development proposal for parking than using this for surface parking. But I'm sure we can have a further discussion on that.
Donna Marie Kurz had said, you are fighting to change our neighborhoods into overdevelopment. You can also help fight to change the lot to the sidewalk issue to make it more bearable visually to current residents. Should you continue to change the landscape to your agenda?
I don't necessarily have an agenda. I'm an attorney that represents developers. That's not necessarily my agenda.
Joe Ruggiero had said, in regards to the so-called roundabout, the traffic study that I have seen shows no roundabout in the new proposal. It will become a T for traffic. Lorraine Burry had said, what type of retail do you plan on having and where will they park?
I can respond. So no selection on a tenant at this time. Typically, fit outs like this for retail occur, in conjunction with approvals. You wouldn't necessarily find a tenant at this point, but certainly something that is relatively lower impact. We're not thinking, we're not thinking a restaurant or something along the lines of high intensity use, but something that's more complementary to the square, whether it's professional offices or something with lower impact, that's certainly accessible for the square itself.
Larry Monito asked, are these apartments or condos?
At this time, they're intended for rental because there is no Article 80 process. We do not necessarily need to declare what they are because there's, not an Article 80 review process in connection with this. However, typically this developer does a mix of units. They've done a number of projects here in East Boston. When it is going to be a condo, they're pretty confident as to what that will be. At this time, this looks like a rental project. That could change based upon market conditions, however.
It doesn't look like we have any questions pertaining to this proposal.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you, Tony. Tony, if it's possible, if you can send me the chat itself, that'll help me create a record of some of the comments. And I can certainly take those back to my client and work towards trying to address some of those concerns.
Of course. Gail did just ask, she asked how much parking is being provided. And if I recall correctly, that was 11 spaces?
11 spaces, that's correct.
All right, and I'll send out the meeting minutes along with the recording. The recording takes a little bit because I send it to the cloud. So along the chat also is with the recording. So I can send the chat along to you, Rich, so that you can provide all that feedback.
Great. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting.
All right. Have a good evening.
You too. And with that, it looks like we are over for our Patriots Day 2021 meeting. Our next meeting is being held on May 17th. I'll reach out to Harborview and see if folks from that association can come to our next meeting and we can have a discussion around those boundaries. And in the meantime, just to get the design review committee going, when we do have informational presentations that come in now, I'll move those over into that meeting and send out the agenda and links, all that info to everybody. Well, we do have a question asking if anyone knows what's going into the New England Casket Company location. I personally do not know what the plan is. We might be able to find out by reaching out to maybe, oh, Gail said 244 units.
Yeah, there's a really large development being proposed there. It's in the early stages. I got to believe that they're going to be coming in front of this group as the process unfolds, likely more than once.
Oh, Joanne Mahoney said, what about New Tread? I first heard of that tonight, so I'm not sure. From what I've heard in the chat, it's going to be about 30 units, but I don't believe anyone has reached out. All right, well, if that is everything, I will post the minutes and the recording and everything shortly. Thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Representative Madaro, Senator Boncory. Have a wonderful rest of your Patriots Day, and I will see you all in May.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.